welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into something fundamental about dealing with people.
Yeah, we've got these sources that all kind of point to this one core idea drawn from, well, all sorts of places, history, psychology.
And this central idea, it's actually pretty startling when you first hear it.
It is. Basically, it says that most people, almost all the time, they just don't blame themselves for anything. Doesn't matter how wrong they might objectively be.
Right. And if that's true, and the sources argue pretty strongly that it is, then it leads to this conclusion. Criticizing or, condemning or complaining, it's basically useless.
Worse than useless, actually. Often dangerous. It backfires.
So our mission today is to unpack why. Why don't people blame themselves? And what does that really mean for, how you interact with people day to day?
And the sources, they don't pull any punches. They start with some really extreme examples to hammer this home.
Yeah, like the story of Two-Gun Crowley back in 1931. The cop killer, they called him.
Cornered by, 150 cops in New York City. After shooting a policeman, it was this huge manhunt.
And while this massive shootout is happening around him, he sits down and writes a letter.
Get this. The letter says, under my coat is a weary heart, but a kind one that would do nobody any harm.
A kind heart. Seriously. After shooting an officer multiple times, it's hard to square that.
Exactly. And it doesn't stop there. Later at Sing Sing, facing the death sentence, did he say, I messed up? No.
What did he say?
He said the sentence was, quote, for defending myself.
Defending himself. Wow, okay. So maybe he's just one extreme case.
Well, that's what you might think. But then they bring up Al Capone, public enemy number one.
Right. Surely he knew he was a gangster.
Apparently not, in his own mind anyway. He saw himself as a public benefactor.
A benefactor.
Al Capone.
An unappreciated and misunderstood public benefactor, according to him. And Dutch Schultz, another notorious gangster, apparently felt the same way, called himself a public benefactor in an interview and seemed to believe it. It's almost comical if it weren't so serious. People just completely rationalizing their own actions.
And it's not just the criminals themselves saying this. They mention Warden Lewis Laws from Sing Sing. Decades of experience.
What did he observe?
He said flat out that very few criminals in Sing Sing saw themselves as bad men. They're just as human as you and I, he said.
Meaning they rationalize.
Totally. They find excuses. They justify everything. Even to themselves, they genuinely believe they shouldn't be in prison.
Okay, so here's the kicker then. If these guys, people who've done objectively terrible things, are so convinced they're not really to blame,
then what chance do you have that the average person you interact with, your colleague, your family member, is going to blame themselves when you think they're wrong?
Probably close to zero, right? The sources argue this is just fundamental human nature.
Which loops us right back to that main principle. Don't criticize, condemn, or complain.
Why? Because it's futile and dangerous.
Futile because the second you criticize, defenses go straight up. They stop hearing the substance and just start thinking about how to justify themselves.
And dangerous because it hurts their pride, their sense of importance. And, pride is a really powerful motivator.
Absolutely. It triggers resentment, deep resentment sometimes.
And there's psychological backing for this, right? It's not just observation.
Yeah, they mentioned B.F. Skinner's work, the experiments with animals. Reward works way better than punishment for learning and retention.
And that applies to humans, too.
Seems so. Later studies found the same. Criticism, like punishment, it doesn't create lasting positive change. It just breeds resentment.
There's that quote from Hans Selye.
Oh, yeah. As much as we thirst for approval, we dread condemnation. That dread is key. It makes criticism actively work against what you want.
So you criticize someone, hoping they'll fix something, but instead you just, demoralize them? Make them angry at you?
Pretty much. In the original situation, probably not corrected. They're too busy justifying themselves or feeling resentful.
Okay, so is there a better way? The sources must offer something.
They do. There's this example of a safety coordinator, George B. Johnston.
What did he do?
Well, initially, he did the typical thing. Saw workers without hard hats, went up, used his authority, put your hard hat on.
And how did that go?
Predictably, right? Sullen compliance. They'd put it on while he was there.
And take it off as soon as he left.
Exactly. Just generated resistance. So he tried something different.
Which was?
Instead of ordering, he'd ask questions. Does the hat feel uncomfortable? Or is it not fitting right?
Trying to understand their perspective first.
Right, and then he'd gently remind them, that hat's designed to protect you from injury. He'd suggest they wear it for their own sake.
And the results?
Much better compliance. And, crucially, no resentment, no emotional flare-ups. He got the behavior change by suggesting and appealing to their self-interest, not by criticizing.
That pattern, criticism failing, it plays out on bigger stages too, doesn't it, historically?
Oh, absolutely. Look at the huge falling out between Theodore Roosevelt and President Taft.
Roosevelt handpicked Taft, went off to Africa.
Comes back and he's furious with Taft's conservatism, denounces him publicly, relentlessly.
And the criticism was brutal, led to Roosevelt running against him, splitting the party.
Yeah, the Bull Moose Party, it completely torpedoed the Republicans. Woodrow Wilson wins. It was a disaster for them.
And Roosevelt felt totally justified, right? He thought Taft was wrong.
Completely. But Taft's reaction, did the criticism make him think, oh, Teddy's right? No.
What did he say?
Sources say with tears in his eyes, he said something like, I don't see how I could have done any differently from what I have.
So, zero self-blame. The criticism just made him double down on his own righteousness.
Precisely. Or think about the Teapot Dome scandal. Huge government corruption in the 1920s.
Albert Falls, Secretary of the Interior, leasing oil reserves to his buddies.
Taking a massive bribe, well, a loan, they called it. Even used Marines to chase off competitors. It was blatant.
Scandal rocked the Harding administration. Fall ended up in prison, universally condemned.
But did he feel condemned? Did he repent?
Let me guess. No.
Never. The sources tell this story. Even later, when someone hinted President Harding might have died from worry over Fall's betrayal, Mrs. Fall apparently just exploded.
Saying what?
Screaming, Harding betrayed by Fall? No. My husband never betrayed anyone. He is the one who has been betrayed and led to the slaughter and crucified.
Crucified. While convicted of bribery. It's just incredible. That level of self-justification.
It really is. And the sources use this to say, look, criticism almost always comes back to bite you, like homing pigeons. The person criticized will justify themselves or they'll turn around and condemn you.
Which brings us to Abraham Lincoln. The sources hold him up as someone who really mastered this.
Yeah, Secretary of War Stanton called him the most perfect ruler of men, partly because he learned how to handle people so well.
But he wasn't always like that, was he?
Not at all. As a young man, he was apparently quite cutting, wrote critical, even ridiculing letters and poems, left them places for people to find.
Ouch. That probably didn't win him many friends.
Caused lasting resentment, the sources say. And even as a young lawyer, he kept attacking opponents in the papers. Until he went too far.
Same Shields incident.
That's the one. Autumn 1842. Lincoln writes anonymous articles mocking this politician, James Shields. Shields finds out who wrote them.
And he was furious. Challenged Lincoln to a duel.
To the death. Shields was enraged. Lincoln, maybe trying to use his height advantage, chose cavalry broadswords.
Broadswords? Good grief.
They actually met on a sandbar, ready to fight, seconds away from potentially killing each other before their friends managed to step in and stop it.
Wow. That must have been a wake-up call.
The sources call it the most lurid personal incident of his life, but also the most important lesson. From that point on, Lincoln changed dramatically. He basically stopped criticizing people, never wrote another insulting letter, rarely ridiculed anyone. He learned that direct criticism just didn't work and was incredibly dangerous.
And you really see this play out during the Civil War, right? Under unimaginable pressure.
Absolutely. Think about the generals he had leading the Army of the Potomac. McClellan, Pope, Burnside, Hooker, Meade. One after another, they made these terrible blunders, drove Lincoln to despair sometimes.
And the public was screaming for their heads, weren't they?
Half the nation. Savage criticism everywhere. But Lincoln, he held his tongue mostly, with malice toward none, with charity for all, as he famously said.
He quoted, "Judge not that ye be not judged," a lot, apparently.
He did. And when people around him, even his wife, would criticize Southerners, Lincoln would say something like, "Don't criticize them, they are just what we would be under similar circumstances." Always trying to understand, not blame.
The ultimate example of this, though, has to be Gettysburg, after the battle.
Oh, yeah. Lee's army is defeated, trapped, the Potomac River is flooded behind them.
Lincoln sees this as the chance. End the war. Now.
Sends urgent orders to General Meade. Attack. Immediately. Don't even hold a council of war, just attack.
But Meade, he hesitates.
He does the exact opposite. Holds a council, delays, sends excuses back to Lincoln, refuses to launch the attack.
And Lee gets away. The river goes down, the army escapes.
Lincoln was beside himself, absolutely furious. Great God, what does this mean? He supposedly cried out. The war would grind on, more lives lost. all because Meade didn't follow orders.
So he wrote Meade a letter, right? A really critical one.
He did. Poured all his frustration and anger into it. The sources quote parts talking about the magnitude of the misfortune, the golden opportunity lost, how the war would be prolonged indefinitely. It was a harsh letter, probably justified, from Lincoln's view.
But, and this is the crucial part,
He never sent it.
he wrote it, got it all out, but then he put it aside. Meade never saw it. It was found years later, after Lincoln's death.
Think about the self-control that took, in that moment of white-hot anger and disappointment, to pause.
Why? Why didn't he send it?
Well, we can only guess, but the sources suggest Lincoln likely put himself in Meade's shoes. Thought about the exhaustion after Gettysburg, the pressure, Meade's cautious nature.
And realized sending the letter would achieve what?
Nothing good, probably. Meade would get defensive, justify himself, maybe resent Lincoln, become less useful as a commander, maybe even resign. Sending the criticism would just make things worse.
So he just swallowed it. Learned from that near-duel years before that sharp criticism is almost always futile.
It's an incredible example of restraint and understanding. No wonder Teddy Roosevelt supposedly looked at Lincoln's portrait when facing tough decisions.
Yeah, the source even suggests maybe we should look at Lincoln on a $5 bill when we feel like criticizing someone.
It's not a bad reminder. And this isn't just for presidents. It applies everywhere. Like Mark Twain.
What about him?
Apparently, he used to write these absolutely scorching letters when he was angry, really let people have it, made him feel better, blow off steam. His wife would secretly intercept them and just not mail them.
Huh. Clever woman. Yeah. So Twain got the release, but no actual damage was done.
Exactly. Maybe there's something to that. Write it down, get it out, then throw it away.
It ties into that old Confucius saying, too, doesn't it? About cleaning your own doorstep before complaining about the snow on your neighbor's roof.
Yeah, focus on yourself first. Maybe that's more productive. The author of one source even shares a personal story about getting criticized.
Oh, yeah.
As a young guy trying to be impressive, he sent a letter with that note dictated but not read at the bottom.
Oh, that pretentious thing.
Right. Well, it went to this famous author, Richard Harding Davis. Davis scribbled right back on the letter.
What'd he write?
Something brutal, like, your bad manners are exceeded only by your bad manners.
Ouch. Direct hit.
And the author admits he resented it intensely. That feeling of hurt, he says, lasted for 10 years, even after he heard Davis had died.
Wow. Shows how deep that sting can go, even if the criticism feels justified to the person giving it.
It really underscores that point about human nature. We're not logic machines. We're creatures of emotion, the sources say, bristling with prejudices and motivated by pride and vanity. Criticism hits right at that pride.
And sometimes it can be truly destructive. They mention Thomas Hardy giving up writing novels because of harsh criticism.
And even suggest it might have contributed to the suicide of the young poet Thomas Chatterton. It can have devastating effects.
So the opposite approach. Like Benjamin Franklin.
Right. Apparently he started out pretty tactless, but he consciously changed, made it a rule. I will speak ill of no man and try to speak all the good I know of everybody.
And that diplomatic, non-critical style really helped him, right? Became an ambassador.
A huge part of his success. It takes real character, though, doesn't it? To understand and forgive instead of just lashing out. Carlyle's quote comes to mind.
Which one?
A great man shows his greatness by the way he treats little men. Choosing understanding over condemnation, even when it feels easier to condemn.
There's that amazing story about the test pilot, Bob Hoover, too.
Yeah. Oh, that's a fantastic one. He lands this plane, everything seems fine, then discovers the mechanic put the wrong fuel in it. Jet fuel instead of gasoline.
Which could have been catastrophic.
Yeah.
A fatal mistake.
Absolutely. And the mechanic is right there, knows what he did. He's apparently in tears, just waiting for Hoover to explode at him, bracing for the worst.
But Hoover doesn't yell.
Doesn't criticize at all, walks over, puts his arm around the mechanic's shoulder.
Says what?
Says something like, to show you, I'm sure that you'll never do this again, I want you to service my F-51 tomorrow.
Wow. Complete trust. No blame. Just focusing on the future.
Totally bypassed condemnation. He understood the mechanic was already punishing himself more than Hoover ever could. It's about rebuilding, not tearing down. Profound understanding.
This even applies to dealing with kids, doesn't it? The sources bring up that piece Father Forgets.
Yeah, it's described as this incredibly popular, enduring piece of writing.
What's the gist of it?
It's a father reflecting, late at night, on how he treated his young son that day. And he realizes with shame just how much she criticized him.
For what kinds of things?
Little things, nagging about how he dressed, leaving shoes muddy, spilling milk, elbows on the table, bad posture, interrupting, just constant fault-finding.
Measuring him by adult standards, basically.
Exactly. And then he remembers how, despite all the scolding, his son came in later looking a bit hurt, maybe, but ran and hugged him goodnight. Unconditional affection.
And the father feels terrible.
Completely ashamed, realizes he's been expecting way too much, stuck in the habit of criticism. He vows to be different, to bite his tongue, to try and understand, to remember he is nothing but a boy, a little boy.
It's powerful because it's so relatable, I think.
Very. And the core message running through all these stories, the criminals, Lincoln, Hoover, this father, it's consistent.
Which is?
Instead of condemning people, which is easy but ineffective and often harmful, try to understand them.
Yeah.
Try to figure out why they do what they do.
Because that understanding is more useful.
Way more useful. And honestly, more interesting, too. It leads to empathy, tolerance, kindness. To know all is to forgive all.
It's a much higher road to take. Reminds me of Dr. Johnson's quote.
Which one's that?
God himself, sir, does not propose to judge man until the end of his days.
Right. So why should we rush in and do it?
Okay, so wrapping this all up then. The first, most fundamental technique in handling people, the big takeaway from this deep dive is:
don't criticize, condemn, or complain. Simple to say, incredibly hard to do consistently.
Because people just don't see their own faults. They rationalize, they justify.
Exactly. And criticism triggers that defensiveness immediately. It wounds pride, it builds that lasting resentment, and it almost never leads to the positive change you actually want.
Understanding, on the other hand, that's where the real leverage is, though it requires more effort from us.
Much more. So the next time you're tempted, and we all are, right, tempted to point out a mistake, complain about someone, find fault.
Whether it's at work, at home, with friends, just pause for a second.
Remember Crowley thinking he was defending himself? Capone, the public benefactor, Taft, who couldn't see doing anything differently, Fall, feeling crucified.
And Lincoln, writing that furious letter to Meade and then putting it away, unsent.
Think about that core principle. People don't blame themselves. Your criticism, even if you feel 100% right, is probably going to backfire. It'll cause hurt, or just make them more convinced they were right.
So here's the final thought to chew on, maybe. If criticism is so likely to fail, if it's more likely to cause damage than positive change.
What does that say about where your real power lies? Is it in trying to force others to see their flaws through criticism?
Or is the real power in changing your response, in choosing to understand instead of condemn? Something to think about.